You really think that old man has a call sign? What's he gonna say, Grandpa one? Lance Corporal Ryan Pierce's voice rang out across the barracks, a cruel laugh following his words. The younger Marines snickered around him, eyes darting between the old man sitting quietly at the edge of the mess hall and the brash, cocky corporal. John Miller, a figure most would overlook, sat there unmoved, his hands folded over his lap, his weathered face hidden behind a veil of gray stubble. Ryan, ever the confident Marine, swaggered over to him, his polished boots clicking against the floor with a rhythmic, almost mocking cadence. "Hey, Pops," Ryan called out, his voice dripping with derision. "You got a call sign, or are you just here to mop the floor?" The old man, who had lived through more battles than Ryan would ever know, didn't flinch. His eyes, pale blue and steady as the ocean, never wavered from the worn coffee cup in front of him. The Marines around Ryan paused, but the corporal pressed on, convinced of his own superiority. "Bet you don't even remember your own rank, huh?" he sneered, leaning in closer, practically daring the man to respond. The room was thick with the unspoken tension of the younger men, eager to see how the old man would react. But John didn't react. His silence was like a storm waiting to break. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, John slowly raised his head. His voice was gravelly, but firm, the words carrying a weight that seemed to resonate with something deeper, something long buried. "Old Bear," he said, his tone calm, unhurried. The impact of his words hit the room like a thunderclap. The Marines, who had been laughing just moments before, froze. It wasn't just the name that caused the shift in the air, it was the way John spoke it, with a quiet authority that demanded respect. Ryan stood there, blinking in disbelief, as the realization hit him like a freight train. The man in front of him wasn't just some old relic from a forgotten war. He was a living legend, someone whose name could silence an entire room, a name that held the power to make even the most cocky Marine step back in awe. For a moment, no one moved. Ryan's bravado melted away, replaced by the uncomfortable sensation of being in the presence of something far greater than he could comprehend. Sergeant Johnson, who had been observing from the doorway, took a step forward, his expression shifting from casual curiosity to something much more serious. The room seemed to hold its breath as he spoke. "Ryan, show some respect," he said, his voice low but firm. "This man, Old Bear, he's earned more in one battle than most of us will in a lifetime. You think your call sign matters now?" The silence in the room grew heavier, as the weight of the moment settled over everyone. Ryan swallowed hard, his earlier arrogance evaporating. It wasn't just the name, it was the history behind it. A history that none of them could ever truly understand. The young Marines shifted uncomfortably, their eyes avoiding John's gaze, knowing now they had underestimated him. The old man didn't need to prove anything. His presence alone was enough. As the tension in the room slowly ebbed away, John simply sat back, his hands resting once more on his lap. He said nothing more. The lesson had been taught, but it wasn't one that could be easily put into words. Respect, true respect, had to be earned through actions, not words. And in that moment, John "Old Bear" Miller had earned it all. The room was still, the air thick with unspoken words. Lance Corporal Ryan Pierce stood frozen, his posture stiff as he tried to process what had just happened. The old man, John "Old Bear" Miller, had spoken, and with those two words, everything shifted. The once dominant arrogance Ryan wore like armor suddenly felt thin, fragile, like it could crack at any moment. He glanced around the room, noticing that the other Marines were no longer laughing. Instead, their faces had gone pale, eyes darting nervously from John to each other. It was as if a switch had been flipped, and in that instant, John became someone they couldn't ignore, someone they didn't dare underestimate. Captain Wilson, who had been observing quietly from the side, took a step forward, his military boots making a solid, purposeful thud on the floor. "Ryan," he said, his voice sharp and controlled, "show some respect." Ryan snapped to attention, the heat rising in his face, but he didn't know what to say. Old Bear. The name echoed in his mind, a call sign that held weight, a call sign that demanded respect. It was a simple thing, just two words, but they carried the burden of history, of battles fought and lives lost, of moments that could never be erased. Sergeant Johnson, who had been watching quietly, nodded to Captain Wilson, as if to silently confirm the depth of the situation. "You have no idea who you're talking to, do you, Ryan?" he asked, his voice low but carrying a weight of its own. Ryan's eyes flickered to John, the old man sitting in front of him, unbothered, calm, as if the world was moving in slow motion around him. "He's not just an old man," Sergeant Johnson continued. "That man is a living legend. You don't get a call sign like that without earning it, without proving yourself in ways you can't even imagine." The words hit Ryan like a punch to the gut. For a moment, he thought about all the times he had mocked John, all the times he had assumed the old man was just a relic of the past, a man too far gone to matter in today's world. But now, with the weight of the room pressing down on him, he realized just how wrong he had been. He swallowed hard, his throat tight, and for the first time, Ryan felt the sting of humility. He glanced at Captain Wilson again, who was still watching him with a stern, no-nonsense expression. "You want to know what it means to be a Marine?" Captain Wilson asked. "To serve with honor, with dignity? That's what you're looking at right now." Ryan opened his mouth to respond, but the words didn't come. How could they? How could he explain away the arrogance, the dismissive laughter, when all he could feel now was a deep sense of respect for the man in front of him? He had no answer. "We all have a lot to learn," Captain Wilson said, his voice softening just a touch, "especially when it comes to those who have walked the path before us." The silence in the room grew heavy, each Marine reflecting on the truth of the captain's words. John, Old Bear, Miller sat quietly, his eyes flicking from one face to another, not seeking validation, but knowing, in that moment, that respect had been earned. The room remained still for what felt like an eternity, and Ryan, once so sure of himself, now understood the true power of silence and the weight of history that he had never taken the time to see. It wasn't just the call sign. It wasn't just the past. It was the presence, the strength in the silence, and the lessons carried through decades of experience. Ryan's chest tightened, his earlier bravado a distant memory as he straightened up and looked John in the eye. "I'm sorry," he said, the words feeling like a confession, an apology for every careless remark, every unearned laugh. John's eyes softened, the slightest hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his lips, but he didn't say anything. He didn't need to. In that simple exchange, the lesson was clear. Respect was not demanded, it was given. And Ryan had just learned what it meant to truly respect the old man who had earned every ounce of it. The days following the incident in the mess hall were quieter, but Ryan couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in his chest. Every time he walked past John, Old Bear Miller, he couldn't help but glance at the old man, wondering what kind of life he had lived, what battles he had fought. The same man who had once seemed like just another old veteran, now felt like a giant whose shadow was far larger than any of them had realized. One afternoon, as Ryan sat in the barracks, staring blankly at his gear, Sergeant Johnson entered, his usual stern expression softening when he saw Ryan lost in thought. "You're still thinking about him, aren't you?" he asked. Ryan shifted in his seat, his eyes meeting the sergeant's. "Yeah," he replied, his voice quieter than usual. I don't get it. How could I have been so wrong?" Sergeant Johnson leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed. "You didn't know," he said simply. "But now you do. And that's the lesson." Ryan frowned. "What lesson?" "That he's some kind of legend." "More than that," Sergeant Johnson said, pushing off the doorframe and sitting down next to Ryan. "It's about understanding that not everything is as it seems. That man, he's not just a call sign. He's a living piece of history, someone who's seen things most of us can't even begin to imagine." Ryan took a deep breath, the weight of the words settling in. "I guess I never thought about it that way. I just saw him as an old man, you know?" "Exactly," Sergeant Johnson said with a nod. "And that's the mistake most people make. They see someone older and think they're past their prime. But real respect, real understanding, comes when you realize that what's on the surface doesn't tell the whole story." Ryan sat in silence, thinking about everything he had assumed about John, about his age, about the way he looked. "So what do I do now?" Ryan asked. Sergeant Johnson leaned back, his gaze distant, as if remembering his own lessons from the past. "You show respect, not because of the call sign, but because of the person behind it. You've learned something. You'll never look at a veteran the same way again. And that's something worth holding on to." Ryan nodded slowly, still processing. Later that afternoon, as the Marines gathered for a routine briefing, John Old Bear Miller entered the room. This time, there was no snickering, no laughter. Ryan, along with everyone else, stood at attention without needing to be told. John nodded, his eyes scanning the room, acknowledging the respect he now commanded. But he didn't need to say a word. His presence, his quiet strength, was enough. As the briefing went on, Ryan found himself paying closer attention to every word John spoke, hanging on each sentence as if it were a piece of wisdom passed down through generations. The rest of the Marines did the same, and for the first time, Ryan understood what Sergeant Johnson had meant. Respect wasn't something that could be demanded. It was something that had to be earned, and once it was, it would never fade. As the briefing ended, John turned to leave, his movements slow but sure. Ryan caught his eye for a brief moment and nodded. This time, it was not a nod of mockery or arrogance, but one of true respect. John Old Bear Miller didn't need to say anything in return. He simply nodded back, as if acknowledging that the lesson had been learned. The Marines filed out of the room, and as Ryan passed John, he couldn't help but think of everything he had learned in such a short time. There was a depth to John that no one had truly seen before, and Ryan was determined not to forget it. As he walked out into the bright afternoon sun, Ryan felt a shift inside him, a sense of understanding that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The next few weeks passed by quietly, but for Lance Corporal Ryan Pierce, everything had changed. He had spent countless hours reflecting on what had happened with John Old Bear Miller. The realization that he had been so quick to judge, to dismiss someone based solely on their appearance, gnawed at him every day. As a Marine, he had been trained to respect authority, to follow orders, but this was different. This was about something deeper, something that went beyond the uniform and the rank. It was about the respect you gave to someone who had earned it through a lifetime of service, of sacrifice, and of quiet strength. One morning, during a routine training session, Sergeant Johnson pulled Ryan aside. "You've been different lately," he said, his voice steady, as always. "What's going on?" Ryan shifted uneasily on his feet. I've been thinking," he started, his voice slower than usual, "about everything that happened with John. I didn't get it before, but now I do. I've been looking at things all wrong." Sergeant Johnson nodded, as though he had expected this moment. "It's a lesson that takes time. But you're not the only one who's had to learn it." Ryan looked up, meeting the sergeant's gaze. "What do you mean?" "We all make mistakes. Some of us just don't realize them until later. But when you start to understand what it means to truly respect someone, like John, it changes you. It changes the way you see the world." Ryan felt a weight settle on his chest, a feeling of gratitude and humility that he hadn't experienced before. It was as if he had been given a glimpse into something much larger than himself. That afternoon, during another routine briefing, John Old Bear Miller entered the room as usual. The Marine stood at attention, not out of obligation, but out of genuine respect. The quiet power he carried with him was undeniable. As Ryan watched him walk into the room, his mind wandered back to the first day he had seen him, how he had mocked him, underestimated him. Now, he saw the old man in a completely different light. As the meeting progressed, Ryan found himself listening more intently, paying attention to every word John spoke. He realized that every line on his face, every gray hair, told a story of a life lived fully, a life of service that had shaped him into the man he was. After the briefing, as the Marines filed out of the room, Ryan approached John. He hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I just wanted to say, thank you," he said, his voice steady but filled with sincerity. John turned to him, his eyes meeting Ryan's with that same calm, steady gaze. "You don't owe me anything," John replied, his voice quiet but firm. "Just remember that respect is earned, and it's not something you give lightly." Ryan nodded, feeling the weight of the words settle deep within him. "I won't forget," he said quietly. As he walked out of the room, the world seemed a little different, a little clearer. The lessons he had learned from John Old Bear Miller would stay with him forever. It wasn't just about respect for the uniform or the rank. It was about understanding the quiet strength that came from a life well lived, a life filled with sacrifice and honor. And in that moment, Ryan understood what it truly meant to be a Marine. Not just in uniform, but in spirit, in heart, and in the way he treated those who had come before him. As the weeks passed, the atmosphere around the base shifted. The respect John, Old Bear, Miller commanded was palpable. No one dared to mock him anymore. Marines who once ignored his presence now greeted him with nods of acknowledgement. It wasn't just the younger recruits. Everyone, from the fresh-faced privates to the senior officers, treated him with a quiet reverence. For Lance Corporal Ryan Pierce, the change was even more pronounced. He had become more thoughtful, more deliberate in his actions. He no longer saw just a uniform or rank. He saw the man behind it, the life that had shaped him. One afternoon, as Ryan was on patrol with a small group of Marines, he noticed something that had previously escaped his attention. An older man, a civilian, was walking by the perimeter of the base. His posture was straight, his gaze unwavering, but there was something about the way he carried himself that caught Ryan's eye. It was the same quiet strength he had seen in John. Without thinking, Ryan approached the man. "Sir, do you need help with something?" he asked, his voice respectful. The man stopped and turned to face him, his eyes narrowing slightly as he sized up Ryan. "I'm fine, son," the man said, his voice low but firm. "Just taking a walk." Ryan felt a flicker of recognition, but couldn't place where he had seen this man before. "You look like you've seen some things," Ryan said, not meaning to pry, but the words just came out. The man nodded, his expression unreadable. "I've seen enough," he said, before adding, "A man's past is never as far behind him as he thinks." Ryan stood still for a moment, processing the words. The man smiled faintly and walked on, leaving Ryan standing there, deep in thought. Later that evening, Ryan found himself in the mess hall, sitting across from Sergeant Johnson, who was quietly eating his meal. The words of the old man echoed in Ryan's mind. A man's past is never as far behind him as he thinks. Ryan looked up at Johnson. Do you think I'll ever really understand the weight of it all? The things that people like John and those who came before us went through." Johnson looked up from his tray, his eyes meeting Ryan's. "You will," he said quietly. "But it's not something that comes easy. It comes when you stop looking at people like John or anyone else as just soldiers or Marines. You see them as people, as veterans, as men and women who've lived through things that changed them. You won't understand all at once, but little by little, it'll become clear." Ryan nodded slowly, feeling the weight of Johnson's words. He had spent so much time focusing on himself, on his training, on his future, that he had never truly taken the time to understand the past. "It's more than just the uniform, isn't it?" Ryan asked, his voice almost a whisper. "Exactly," Johnson replied, his voice firm, but with a trace of something deeper in it. "It's about who you are and the respect you give to those who came before you. The uniform doesn't make the man. The man makes the uniform." Ryan sat back, reflecting on everything he had learned. It wasn't just about following orders or completing missions. It was about understanding the sacrifices of those who had worn the same uniform before him, about respecting the past and honoring it by carrying forward the values that made them who they were. Later that night, as Ryan lay in his bunk, he thought about John, Old Bear, Miller once more. He remembered the calmness in his voice, the way he stood tall without needing to say much. Ryan realized something important. John didn't have to prove anything. He had already proven it with his actions, with the life he had lived. Ryan now understood that respect was not just something given in a moment. It was earned over a lifetime, through actions, choices, and the way you treated others. As he closed his eyes, Ryan knew that he would carry that lesson with him, always. It wasn't about the rank. It wasn't about the call sign. It was about the man behind them, and the legacy he left for those who followed. As the months went by, Lance Corporal Ryan Pierce found himself shifting in ways he hadn't expected. The lessons he'd learned from John, Old Bear, Miller, and his newfound perspective on respect began to influence more than just his interactions with veterans. It started to affect how he viewed his fellow Marines, how he saw his superiors, and how he understood the true meaning of leadership. One morning, during a routine physical training session, Ryan found himself alongside a group of young recruits, all eager and full of energy, their youthful enthusiasm a stark contrast to the seasoned Marines around them. As they began their laps around the track, Ryan's thoughts wandered. He had been the one to mock John at first, the one to belittle the old man because he hadn't taken the time to truly see him. Now he was the one who stood tall, walking with purpose, ready to lead by example. Sergeant Johnson, ever observant, noticed Ryan's change. "You're different," he said as they jogged side by side. "Something on your mind, son?" Ryan glanced over at the sergeant, his pace steady. "I've been thinking about how I used to see things. I didn't get it, you know? I thought respect was just something you gave because someone outranked you. But it's more than that." Sergeant Johnson nodded, his expression unreadable. "Respect isn't just about rank, Ryan. It's about understanding that everyone has something to offer. Every Marine, every veteran, they've earned their place. And when you understand that, you start leading from the right place." Ryan absorbed the words, letting them settle in. As they completed their laps and gathered in the formation, Ryan couldn't help but notice the way the recruits looked at him now. The way they saw him differently, with a bit more respect. It wasn't because he was an older Marine or because of his rank. It was because they saw that Ryan had learned something important, something they were still figuring out. Later that day, during a briefing with Captain Wilson, Ryan found himself thinking about the lessons he'd learned over the past few months. It wasn't just about following orders anymore. It was about leading by example, about understanding the weight of the uniform and what it represented. Captain Wilson, noticing Ryan's quiet reflection, addressed the room. "Leadership isn't about barking orders," he said, his voice calm but filled with authority. "It's about setting an example. It's about earning respect, not demanding it." Ryan looked up at the captain, the words resonating deeply within him. He had seen the truth of those words in John, Old Bear, Miller, in the way the old man had carried himself, in the quiet strength that commanded respect without a single word. It was a lesson Ryan would carry with him for the rest of his career. As the briefing ended and the Marines filed out of the room, Ryan stayed behind for a moment. He walked over to Captain Wilson, who was packing up his notes. "Sir," Ryan began, his voice steady, "I just wanted to thank you for everything. For the lessons." Captain Wilson looked up, his eyes meeting Ryan's. "It's not me you should thank," he replied. "It's the ones who've gone before you. The ones like John, who've earned their place. The ones who've shown you what real leadership looks like." Ryan nodded, a sense of gratitude filling him. As he walked out of the briefing room, he felt lighter, as though a burden had been lifted from his shoulders. He was no longer just following orders. He was understanding the deeper meaning behind them. He was becoming the kind of Marine, the kind of leader who earned respect not through rank or fear, but through his actions and the example he set for those who came after him. The sun was setting as Ryan walked across the base, the colors of the sky fading into shades of orange and pink. He couldn't help but think of John, Old Bear Miller, of the lessons he had learned, and of the journey that still lay ahead. He didn't know where it would take him, but he was ready. He had found his path, and it was one built on respect, honor, and the understanding that true leadership began with the humility to learn from those who had gone before. As the months passed, Ryan's understanding of leadership continued to grow, and the weight of his responsibilities as a Marine began to sink in deeper than ever before. He had been molded in the crucible of service, but it was his experiences with John, Old Bear Miller that had shaped him into the kind of man he wanted to be. It was no longer about simple obedience or following orders. It was about leading with integrity and learning from those who had walked the path before him. One evening, after a long day of training, Ryan found himself sitting alone in the common room of the barracks, reflecting on everything that had changed. His mind often returned to John, the old man who had taught him more than anyone else had in the years he had served. Ryan had grown fond of their brief conversations, though they were few and far between. John never pushed for attention, never sought to be in the spotlight. He simply shared his wisdom in the quietest of ways, and it was up to those around him to listen and learn. That evening, as Ryan sat by himself, Sergeant Johnson entered the room. He looked around before spotting Ryan, who had a distant look in his eyes. "You've been quiet lately," Sergeant Johnson said as he approached. "You okay, son?" Ryan turned to face his sergeant, his expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking a lot," he replied, his voice low. "About everything. About what it means to be a Marine, about leadership, and about what John taught me. It's like the more I understand, the more I realize how much I still have to learn." Sergeant Johnson nodded slowly, as if he had expected this. "That's the thing about this job, Ryan," he said, sitting down beside him. "You never stop learning. You don't stop growing. You don't stop realizing that there's always someone out there who knows more than you, and that's okay. But what makes you a leader isn't knowing everything. It's knowing how to listen, how to grow from those who have been there before you. Ryan absorbed the words, feeling the weight of them settle in his chest. It was a truth that had become clearer to him with each passing day, each interaction he had with the men and women around him. He had learned to respect those who had served before him, to appreciate the quiet strength that came with experience, and to value the lessons they had to offer. Later that night, as Ryan walked outside for some fresh air, he saw John sitting on a bench near the edge of the base. The old man's silhouette was outlined against the setting sun, his posture as straight as ever. Ryan approached slowly, not wanting to disturb the quiet peace that surrounded him. "Mind if I sit?" Ryan asked softly. John glanced over at him, offering a small nod. "Go ahead," he said in his steady, gravelly voice. Ryan sat down beside him, the silence between them comfortable, not awkward. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. It was as if the world had slowed down, and all that mattered was the quiet bond between them. Finally, Ryan broke the silence. "I've been thinking a lot about what you taught me," he said quietly. "About respect. About leadership. I think I finally get it." John nodded again, his eyes scanning the horizon. "It's not something you learn overnight," he replied. "It takes time. It takes experience. But the most important thing you can do is never stop learning." Ryan sat in silence for a moment, contemplating the weight of John's words. He had learned so much already, but the journey was far from over. As he looked at John, he realized that it wasn't just the lessons that mattered, it was the man himself. John wasn't just a veteran or an old man. He was a living testament to the power of humility, the strength of quiet leadership, and the importance of honoring the past. "I won't forget what you've taught me," Ryan said, his voice firm. John's expression softened, but he didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The lesson had been learned. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Ryan felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just following orders anymore. He was becoming the kind of Marine who could lead with integrity, who could carry the lessons of those who had come before him, and who would never stop learning. And with that realization, Ryan knew he was ready for whatever came next. As the seasons changed, so did the mood at the base. Ryan felt a shift inside him that he couldn't quite put into words. It wasn't just the passing of time, or the new skills he was gaining through training. It was deeper, something that had been growing ever since he had first met John, Old Bear Miller. Every day, Ryan became more aware of how much he had yet to learn, not just about being a Marine, but about being a person, about understanding the true meaning of service and leadership. One cold morning, during a routine inspection, Captain Wilson approached Ryan with a slightly different tone than usual. "I've been watching you lately," he said, his voice steady. "You're a different Marine than the one who first showed up here." Ryan looked up at him, slightly surprised. "Different how, sir?" Captain Wilson gave a small nod, as if he were confirming something to himself. "You've started leading by example. I see it in the way you interact with the new recruits. I see it in the way you approach training. You're not just doing the bare minimum anymore. You're thinking beyond that. You're thinking like a leader." Ryan felt a sense of pride swell in his chest, but it was tempered with a humbling realization. "I've learned a lot, sir," he said quietly, "and I still have a lot to learn." Captain Wilson smiled, a rare but genuine expression. That's the mark of someone who's truly ready to lead, understanding that there's always room for growth. As the days went on, Ryan found himself thinking about the captain's words. He realized that the more he learned, the more he was drawn to the veterans, to the stories they held, and to the lessons they could share. The truth was, no one had all the answers. Even the most seasoned Marines, the ones with years of experience, were still learning, still growing. It was the humility to admit that, and the drive to improve, that set true leaders apart. One afternoon, as Ryan was walking through the base, he saw John Old Bear Miller sitting on the same bench he had seen him on months ago. This time, there was no hesitation. Ryan walked over and sat down next to him, the quiet connection between them feeling more natural than ever before. For a moment, they sat in silence, watching the world go by. Then, Ryan spoke, his voice soft. "You know, I've been thinking about what you said to me a while ago. About respect. About leadership." John glanced over at him, nodding slightly. "It's not something you figure out all at once. It takes time. It takes experience. But most importantly, it takes patience." Ryan nodded slowly, taking in the weight of the words. I used to think I had to have all the answers, he admitted. But now I see that it's not about having all the answers. It's about being open to learning from everyone, whether it's the guy next to you in the trenches or the one who's been there before. John's gaze softened, a small smile playing on his lips. Exactly, he said. Leadership isn't about being perfect. It's about doing your best and knowing that you're part of something bigger than yourself. It's about making sure the people who follow you know that you've got their back. Ryan sat back, reflecting on everything John had taught him. He had come to realize that leadership wasn't just about telling others what to do. It was about guiding them, about sharing wisdom, and about supporting them when they needed it most. It was a lesson that could only be learned through experience, through watching others, and through understanding the sacrifices made by those who came before him. As the sun began to set, casting a golden hue over the base, Ryan felt a sense of peace wash over him. He knew that his journey was far from over. There would be challenges ahead, moments where he would feel unsure of himself. But he also knew that he was on the right path. A path built on respect, humility, and the willingness to learn from the past. As he stood up from the bench and saluted John, Old Bear, Miller, Ryan knew that this was just the beginning of the man he was becoming. A man who would lead not just with authority, but with integrity, with heart, and with a deep understanding of the sacrifices that came before him. As the months went by, Ryan's transformation became even more apparent. His fellow Marines, especially the new recruits, began to look up to him as a natural leader. It wasn't because of his rank or his years of service, but because of the way he carried himself. He had stopped looking at leadership as a title and started to view it as a responsibility. He understood that leadership wasn't about giving orders. It was about being someone others could rely on, someone who would lead by example. It was a rainy morning when Captain Wilson called Ryan into his office. The walls were lined with maps and military plans, the air thick with the scent of coffee and paperwork. Ryan stood at attention as the captain gestured for him to sit. Ryan, Captain Wilson began, I've been hearing some good things about you lately. Your name's come up in a few conversations, and I wanted to take a moment to recognize that. Ryan felt his heart skip a beat, unsure of what the captain was going to say next. Your leadership has been noticeable, even to those who don't always speak up, Captain Wilson continued, his tone steady and professional. You've shown the kind of qualities we need in this unit. Your peers respect you, and I've seen how you've stepped up when it mattered most. I just wanted to make sure you knew that. Ryan shifted slightly in his chair, humbled by the words, but also feeling the weight of them. Thank you, sir, he said, his voice steady but filled with sincerity. I've been learning a lot. Captain Wilson nodded. Good. Keep that humility. It'll carry you further than any rank or title ever will. Ryan left the office that day with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt before. The recognition from Captain Wilson meant more than any award or commendation could. It wasn't about the praise. It was about the realization that he had become someone who led with integrity, someone who had learned how to balance authority with empathy. Over the following weeks, Ryan continued to grow in his role, embracing the challenges that came his way. But the lessons he had learned from John, Old Bear, Miller remained at the core of his understanding of leadership. One day, after a particularly long training session, Ryan found himself sitting on the steps of the barracks, the cool evening air brushing against his face. He was deep in thought when he heard the familiar voice behind him. You look like you're carrying the weight of the world, John said, walking up the steps to sit beside him. Ryan chuckled softly, looking over at the old man. Sometimes it feels that way, he admitted, but I'm getting used to it. It's not always easy, but I think I'm starting to understand what it means to be a leader. John nodded, a faint smile crossing his face. Good. It's not about carrying the weight alone, he said, his voice calm but firm. It's about knowing when to ask for help, when to rely on those around you. Leadership is about bringing others up with you, not doing it all on your own. Ryan sat in silence for a moment, letting the words sink in. He had learned that lesson the hard way, but now, it made more sense than ever. It wasn't just about him. It was about the Marines he led, the people who depended on him to guide them, support them, and help them grow. I think I get it now, Ryan said quietly. I don't have to do it alone. It's not about being perfect, it's about doing the best I can and helping others do the same. John's gaze softened, and he placed a hand on Ryan's shoulder. That's the real lesson, son. You're on the right path. Keep walking it. As Ryan sat there, feeling the weight of the words settle deep inside him, he realized how far he had come. He wasn't the same young Marine who had first walked onto the base, unsure of his place. He had learned to lead with humility, with heart, and with an understanding of the people around him. And as he looked to the future, Ryan knew that the journey was far from over. There would always be more lessons to learn, more challenges to face. But with each step, he would carry the lessons of those who had come before him, like John Old Bear Miller, and continue to grow into the leader he was meant to be.